The doctor said there was nothing wrong with my heart, and I was relieved. At 74, every visit to the cardiologist is a small ordeal, although I try not to show my anxiety. Dr. Harris smiled as he wrote a prescription for the usual pills and reminded me of my next visit in a month. I nodded, tucked the papers into my purse, and headed for the Craig Road exit of the clinic. The bus home was slow, stopping at every corner. Passengers were silently looking at their phones or staring out the windows at the monotonous neighborhoods of North Las Vegas. I sat by the window and thought about how my life had changed over the past 2 years. After Robert's funeral, the house had seemed too big and quiet until Brian had offered to move in with me and Jessica. It seemed like a smart decision at the time. They needed to save money on rent, and I wanted to have my family around. Memories came flooding back one after another as the bus dragged down the busy street. Robert always said Brian was too soft to handle life's challenges on his own. My husband saw in his son a lack of grit, an inability to make firm decisions. I defended Brian at the time, thinking that Robert was too hard on him. Now, after 2 years of living together with my son and his wife, I was beginning to realize that my husband was right in many ways. Brian was really avoiding responsibility. When something serious broke down in the house, he would put off the repairs until I found a handyman myself. When there were problems with paperwork or bills, he would suggest that I take care of them myself, citing that I was busy looking for a job. It had been 6 months, and I suspected he wasn't in any particular hurry to find a permanent position. Jessica worked at a beauty parlor across town. She left every morning in her used Toyota, returning late at night tired and cranky. The customers were stingy, the tips were meager, and the salon owner was always nagging her about little things. At dinner, Jessica would talk about her work troubles, and Brian would nod sympathetically and promise that he would find a good job soon, and then his wife could afford to rest. The key turned in the lock with the familiar click. The house greeted me with an unusual silence. Jessica was usually in the living room at this time, watching her soap operas, the sound of the television blaring throughout the first floor. Whether it was programs about the lives of rich housewives or crime dramas, Jessica devoured them all with unrelenting interest, commenting loudly on the characters' actions. I took off my shoes and walked down the hallway, listening to the sounds upstairs. Someone was moving furniture or going through things, and there were muffled knocks and rustles. The sounds were coming from my bedroom, which was odd. Neither Brian nor Jessica ever went in there without asking. We'd agreed on privacy from the start. I stayed out of their room. They didn't touch my stuff. Doris, you're back. Jessica appeared on the stairs with a rag in her hands and a smile that seemed too wide. How are things at the doctor's office? All good, I replied, hanging my purse on the hook by the door. What are you doing in there? I'm cleaning the bedroom. Jessica came downstairs and wiped the stair railing with a rag. I thought I'd clean up while you were gone. You know how important it is to keep things clean. It was more than a little weird. In our 2 years together, I'd never seen Jessica take such a proactive approach to cleaning. She usually limited herself to washing the dishes after herself and occasionally vacuumed the living room after I reminded her to do so. Her philosophy of housework was to do the minimum necessary, quickly, without too much effort, to free up time for more interesting activities. Suddenly, she's taken over my bedroom in my absence. Where's Brian? I asked, trying to get my voice to sound normal. He's in the garage fixing something. He said your car had battery problems. Jessica kept smiling, but I could see that she was avoiding looking me in the eye. Instead, she was concentrating on wiping the already clean surfaces as if she'd found some invisible dirt on them. I walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. My car was fine, having gone to the supermarket yesterday without the slightest problem. The engine started with the first turn of the key, and there were no suspicious noises or malfunctions. Why did Brian have to get under the hood? Through the window, I could see him fiddling with the old VW, but his movements seemed haphazard, as if he were just pretending to be busy, waiting for me to return. I poured water into a glass and drank slowly, watching my son through the kitchen window. Brian lifted the hood, peered inside, then closed it and opened it again. No tools in his hands, he just walked around the car, occasionally glancing toward the house. When our eyes met through the glass, he waved and gave me a thumbs up, as if signaling that everything was okay. Mom, Brian entered the house through the back door, wiping his hands on a rag. How was your trip? What did the doctor say? It's fine. What about the car? Oh, it's nothing. I cleaned the terminals. It'll start better now. He sat down at the table and looked at his wife with a serious look. Jess, show Mom what we found. Jessica disappeared and came back with a box of papers. I recognized it immediately. These were the folders of Robert's papers I kept in the bedroom closet on the top shelf. The box had been there for 2 years, ever since I'd taken apart my husband's desk and put all the papers in one place. My face must have shown surprise because Brian was quick to explain. We were cleaning upstairs and came across these folders. We thought maybe we should sort through them. Get the paperwork in order, throw out what we don't need. There's a lot of old bills and stuff, Jessica added, setting the box on the table as if she were doing me a huge favor. Why keep something you can't use anymore? I opened one of the folders. Indeed, there were old electric bills, insurance receipts for Robert's car that we'd sold a year ago. But in between were important documents: marriage certificates, house titles, bank statements, insurance policies. All of it lay neatly laid out, but not in the order I'd left it. I had always stacked the papers by date, from old to new, and now they were jumbled. Moreover, I noticed that some of the papers were in a separate pile, as if someone had set them aside for closer examination. In this stack were those papers that were related to property and finances: house deeds, bank statements for the last few years, agreements with pension funds. I'll sort through my own papers, I said, closing the folder. Of course, Mom. We just wanted to help. Brian pulled his chair closer, and I felt him tense up. But you know what? Maybe we should organize the paperwork. Bring everything up to date with the new situation. What new situation? Well, you're living alone now. I mean, we're with you, of course, but technically, he hesitated for words, and I saw Jessica nudge him with her elbow. I mean, a lot of the paperwork is still in Dad's name, and he's gone. Jessica nodded, supporting her husband. Yeah, and then, if something happens, it's better to be clear and accessible. For your own peace of mind. The words sounded rote, as if they had rehearsed this conversation. Jessica was talking too fast, and Brian was blinking too often, a sure sign that he was nervous. I looked at them both again. Brian was rubbing the edge of his napkin. Jessica was too diligently wiping the already perfectly clean table. Their behavior reminded me of the employees who'd come to my office asking for a promotion. The same feigned concern. The same roundabout maneuvers instead of direct questions. 30 years as a human resources manager for a large insurance company taught me to understand people and their motivations. When a person wants to get something but does not dare to say it directly, he starts to create excuses, justifications, circumstances. First, they prepare the ground, small favors, increased attention, care. Then there is talk about problems that supposedly need to be solved. And only at the end there is a specific request, which is presented as the only reasonable way out of the situation. Brian and Jessica were clearly in the second stage of this process. They had already created a reason the need to get the paperwork in order, but they were not yet ready to voice their real goal. They wanted something from me, but they were afraid to ask me directly, preferring to be subtle. All right, I said calmly. We'll see about that later. Right now, I want to rest. I took the box and headed for the stairs. Brian jumped up so sharply that his chair shook. Mom, let me help you carry it. I can do it myself. Upstairs, I locked the bedroom door and set the box on the bed. The room smelled foreign, a mixture of Jessica's cheap perfume and Brian's cologne. They definitely spent quite a bit of time here, going through my things. The papers had indeed been thoroughly reviewed. I'd always organized them chronologically, but now they were all jumbled together, as if someone had gone through them in a hurry, looking for something specific. I also noticed that the cabinet had been moved slightly. Usually it was up against the wall, but now there was a finger-wide gap between it and the wallpaper. So they were looking for something not only in the files, but in other places as well. Maybe they were hoping to find a will or some financial papers I hadn't told them about. Muffled voices were heard outside the door. Brian and Jessica were whispering about something downstairs, but I couldn't make out the words. The intonation was anxious, worried. Jessica's voice rose at times, but then quieted again, as if Brian were urging her to be careful. I sat down on the bed and tried to figure out what was going on. The sudden cleaning activity, the rummaging through my papers, the strange talk of putting papers in order. It all added up to an unpleasant picture. Robert had left me a house, a car, and the savings from 2 pensions. Not wealth, of course, but enough to live peacefully for the rest of my days without needing anyone's help. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe my son decided it was time to take care of the inheritance while I was still sane and able to sign the papers. Maybe Jessica is pushing him to take more action, hinting that time is of the essence. I knew they were in serious financial trouble. Brian had already been listed for 6 months looking for a new position after being downsized at a construction company, and unemployment benefits were ridiculously small. Jessica worked at a beauty salon for a small salary plus occasional tips, barely enough for gas and cosmetics. They didn't pay rent, and I fed them breakfast and dinner, but the rest of the expenses fell on their shoulders. The voices downstairs died down. I got up and went to the window. There was no one in the yard, only Mrs. Collins, the neighbor's cat, wandering between the rose bushes, looking for birds. The day was drawing toward evening, and the sun was setting behind the roofs of the monotonous houses in our neighborhood, painting the sky the usual orange and pink colors. Everything looked peaceful and ordinary, but inside the house, something was different. It was as if the air was electrified with reticence and hidden agendas. I went back to the box and looked through the documents once more. Someone was especially scrutinizing the certificate of ownership of the house and the latest bank statements. Some of the papers had barely visible fingerprints on them, as if they had been held in their hands for a long time, reading every line. It was becoming clear that this wasn't a matter of simple curiosity or a desire to help clean up. Someone really wanted information about my financial situation. By 6 p.m., the smell of fried onions and garlic filled the house. Jessica was cooking something special. Usually our dinners were limited to simple dishes that didn't require much fiddling in the kitchen. Tonight, she'd been at the stove for over an hour, stirring, tasting, adding spices. Through the open kitchen door, I could hear the sounds of cooking and humming, and Jessica was clearly in a good mood. I came downstairs about 7:30. The table was set with the utmost care, the best plates we'd gotten only on holidays, candles and candle holders. Even the napkins were cloth rather than paper. Brian was sitting in the living room, leafing through a magazine, but I noticed that he hadn't turned a page in about 10 minutes. His gaze was absent, as if his mind was on something else entirely. "Dinner's ready," Jessica announced, appearing in the doorway with a large platter in her hands. "Doris, sit down at the table. Tonight is a special night." "How is it special?" I asked, taking my usual seat. "I just wanted to make the family happy." Jessica set the roasted chicken and vegetables on the table. It looked delicious and smelled even better. You know, it's so rare for us to get together around a beautifully set table. That was true. We usually ate dinner in front of the TV, each with his own plate, silently devouring our food to the sound of news or shows. Conversations over meals didn't happen often. Brian preferred to look at his phone. Jessica talked about work, and I listened more than talked. The family traditions that Robert and I had taken for granted gradually faded after his death. Brian joined us at the table and poured wine for all three of us. Red dry, my favorite kind, which he rarely bought, deeming it too expensive for everyday consumption. Tonight's dinner was definitely planned as an event, though I saw no reason for celebration. To family, Brian raised his glass. To being together. We clinked glasses, and I noted the nervous smile on my son's face. His fingers trembled slightly as he brought the glass to his lips. Jessica, on the other hand, seemed completely relaxed. She smiled broadly and naturally, as if she were really enjoying the moment. The first few minutes passed in the usual conversation about food, the weather, what was on the news. Jessica talked about a new client at the salon, a cranky lady who couldn't decide on a manicure color for 3 hours. Brian mentioned that the employment agency had called, promising to pick up a few options next week. Everything seemed natural and relaxed, but I could sense some tension underneath the outward calm. By the way, Mom, Brian put down his fork and looked at me seriously. Jess and I have been talking about your situation. What situation? Well, the financial situation. He hesitated, searching for words. You see, when you live alone, especially at our age, at your age, I mean, it's important that everything be organized properly. Jessica nodded. Yes, we're worried. What if something happens and the paperwork is in disarray? Or bank accounts get blocked because of some formalities? What could happen? I asked, continuing to eat the chicken. Anything can happen, Brian shrugged. Illnesses, accidents? God forbid, of course, but it's better to be prepared. The conversation was taking exactly the turn I'd expected after the day's incident with the documents. They were leading me to something concrete, but they were doing it carefully, testing my reaction to every word. The tactic was familiar. I'd seen it many times in the office when employees wanted a raise or extra vacation. So, what are you suggesting? I decided to speed things up. Brian and Jessica looked at each other, and I realized that they had assigned roles in this conversation. We were thinking, Jessica began, maybe we should simplify our financial management, like a power of attorney or something, so that any issues could be dealt with quickly if necessary. Power of attorney for what? Banking, real estate, Brian said more confidently now, as if he felt the ice was breaking. Just for convenience. You know how hard it is to get to a bank or a notary sometimes. It was interesting. Until today, neither of them had shown the slightest interest in my financial affairs. Brian had never offered to help with trips to the bank, and Jessica didn't even know which bank I had accounts at. Suddenly, there was this touching concern for the ease of managing my money. I'm doing just fine on my own, I said. I haven't had any difficulties so far. Sure, Mom. Brian hastily agreed. We're just thinking ahead. You know how it is. Today, everything is fine, and tomorrow there may be problems. Jessica agreed. Yes, and then, isn't it more relaxing when you know that people close to you will be able to help in any situation? Families should support each other. The words about family and support sounded beautiful, but I remembered how this same family had behaved over the past months. Gradually, imperceptibly, they limited my social circle, convincing me to give up many of my usual activities. It had started with little things. Jessica had expressed concern about my hiking in the park. Doris, it's not safe, she said. There are so many strange people roaming the streets. It's better to stay home and read or watch TV. Then Brian got worried about me taking the bus to my friends' houses. Mom, you know how the roads are now. What if something happens? Who's gonna help you? Why don't you invite Pam or Ruth over to our house? But inviting my friends home became awkward after Jessica had several times yawned defiantly during their visits or turned the TV up full volume when we tried to talk. Pam told me bluntly that she felt uncomfortable in a house where she was clearly not welcome. Ruth was more tactful, but also started coming less often and then stopped altogether. Meetings with former coworkers also fell off. I skipped corporate parties and holidays on the pretext of being tired or feeling sick, when in fact I just didn't want to listen to Brian and Jessica's reproaches about how irresponsible it was of me to drive around the city at night. My weekly trips to the library stopped after Jessica's insistence that I order books online. Why would you want to drive all the way across town? You can get everything delivered to your house now. Gradually, my world shrank to the size of our house and the nearest stores. I didn't even notice it happening right away. Each restriction was introduced under a plausible pretext: concern for my safety, the desire to save me from unnecessary hassle, the desire to create a comfortable home environment. Now, looking at the concerned faces of my son and daughter-in-law, I realized that isolation was only the first stage of their plan. A person who rarely leaves the house and has little contact with outsiders is much easier to control. He has no independent sources of information or support, no one to complain to or ask for advice. You know, Doris, Jessica continued, we're not just housemates, we're a family, and a family should trust each other. Of course we should, I agreed. That's why I trust you. You live in my house. You use everything in it. I've never charged you rent or utilities. That remark hit the mark. Brian blushed slightly, and Jessica began busily cutting the meat on her plate, avoiding looking at me. They had actually been living here for free for 2 years now, saving thousands of dollars that they could spend on their own needs. We really appreciate it, Mom, Brian finally said. And that's why we want to help. We can see how tired you are of all these financial issues. What financial issues? I pay my bills, I go to the bank once a month, I get my pension. What's so complicated? Well, like taxes, Jessica found a new argument. Every year it's a hassle to file. And insurance? You have to renew them on time, keep up with changes and conditions. Actually, I've never had a problem with taxes. Robert taught me the basics of financial literacy when I was young, and I got used to doing everything on my own. I filled in my tax returns myself, renewed my insurance on time, and monitored my investments through online banking. I'm doing okay so far, I said again. Of course you are. Brian tried a different approach. But why bother when you can delegate some of the work? You've earned a peaceful old age. The phrase, a peaceful old age, made me laugh. At 74, I felt quite energetic and capable. Morning exercise, proper nutrition, and regular medical checkups kept me in good shape. There were no memory or coordination problems, and doctors found no signs of dementia or other age-related diseases. I don't want a peaceful old age, I said. I want an active and independent life. There was an awkward pause. Jessica sipped her wine and tried to change the subject. Remember last year when we went to the lake? It was such a beautiful day. We didn't go last year, I corrected. You talked me out of it, saying it was too tiring. Another awkward pause. Brian finished his wine and got up from the table. Okay, Mom, we just wanted to help. If you change your mind, let me know. After dinner, I went up to my room and locked the door. As I replayed the fragments of the evening's conversation in my head, the picture became clearer and clearer. First, the isolation, then the attempt to gain control of the finances. It was a classic scheme I'd read about in crime reports. That's what scammers do to elderly people, entering their confidence under the guise of caring relatives or friends. Only in my case, The fraudsters were my own son and his wife. Sleep didn't come. I had been lying in bed for over 2 hours, listening to the sounds of the house getting ready for the night. The floorboards in the hallway creaked as Brian went up to his room. The water in the pipes rumbled as Jessica took a shower. Then there was silence, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the nightstand and the sound of cars on the distant highway. Her thoughts were confused and kept coming back to the same thing. The conversation at dinner, the digging through my papers, the strange behavior of my son and daughter-in-law, it all added up to a picture I didn't want to accept as real. Was Brian really capable of such a thing? My own son, the one I'd raised, the one I'd given the best years of my life to? I remembered what he'd been like as a child. A quiet, obedient boy who never caused any serious trouble. He was average in school, not very diligent, but also without obvious problems. Teachers called him a quiet child, although Robert always worried that his son lacked character and determination. He gives up too easily, his husband said when Brian gave up another hobby after a few weeks. First, he wanted to play soccer, then basketball, then tennis. He didn't excel at anything because he found excuses at the first hurdles. I defended my son at the time, thinking that Robert was making too high demands on him. I thought that a child has the right to search, to experiment, to make mistakes. But now I realized that my husband saw in Brian's character what he saw in his adult life, a tendency to take the easy way out, an unwillingness to take responsibility, a willingness to put problems on someone else's shoulders. After high school, Brian entered college, but after a year he dropped out, citing the fact that the specialty does not suit him. Then there was the Army, which gave him some discipline, but after demobilization, he again began to drift through life, changing jobs and hobbies. He met Jessica when he was 32, and I hoped that marriage would give him stability. Jessica seemed like a practical girl who could be a pillar of support for Brian. She worked at a bank, drove a car, and knew how to plan a budget. But gradually, I realized that Jessica's practicality was of a special kind. She was better at counting other people's money than she was at earning her own. At the bank, she was a simple clerk with no career prospects, but she was well versed in financial schemes and loopholes. It was Jessica who convinced Brian to take out a loan to buy a house right after the wedding, even though they had no stable income to pay. It was she who insisted on leasing an expensive car, explaining that it was more profitable than buying a used one. The result was predictable. 3 years later, they lost the house, the car had to be repossessed, and the debts accumulated to such an extent that the young family had to rent a one-room apartment in a disadvantaged neighborhood. When Robert died and I suggested they move in with me, Jessica jumped at the opportunity with enthusiasm. She immediately started making suggestions for improving the house, rearranging the furniture, updating the interior. She talked about how great it was that we were now living as a family, how important it was to support each other in times of need. The first few months were indeed enjoyable. The house was filled with voices and movement again. I felt needed and useful. I cooked big dinners, helped Jessica with household chores, and gave Brian money for gas and small expenses. It seemed that we really created a harmonious family where everyone takes care of the others. But gradually, the relationship began to change. Jessica was increasingly dissatisfied with my habits. I get up too early and make noise in the kitchen, watch TV too loudly, invite my girlfriends over at inappropriate times. Brian supported his wife, gently but persistently suggesting that I change my daily routine, limit my social contacts, and spend more time at home. Now, lying in the dark and analyzing the last 2 years, I realized that the changes had followed a certain system. First, comfort and a sense of care were created. Then restrictions were gradually introduced under the guise of sound advice, and now the third stage had begun, an attempt to gain control over my finances. The clock showed 1:30 in the morning. I got out of bed and threw on a robe. My mouth was dry and I wanted water. My slippers slid soundlessly across the parquet as I walked down the stairs. The house was dark, with only a street light casting a streak of light through the living room window. I reached the kitchen and stopped at the door. Muffled voices came from inside. Brian and Jessica were sitting at the table talking quietly, thinking I was asleep. My heart raced. Would I really get to hear what they were hiding? It can't go on like this forever, Jessica whispered. We've been at this point for 2 years. I know, but we can't rush into it. If she suspects anything, she already does. Did you see the way she looked at us today? She's not stupid, Brian. Then what do you suggest? Give her more. Tell her we're in financial trouble, that we need her help. Win her over. And if it doesn't work? Jessica was quiet for a moment, then said something so quietly I couldn't make out the words. But the tone was firm, determined. Brian countered, "It's too risky." Risky. Jessica's voice got a little louder. What do we have to lose? A job at the salon? Your search for a job that doesn't exist? We have nothing, Brian. Absolutely nothing. I heard a chair pull back. One of them stood up and headed for the sink. Quickly retreating into the living room, I hid behind the couch. Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway and listened, then returned to the table. We need to be more aggressive, she continued. Find the deeds to the house. Find out how the inheritance was organized. Maybe it's all ready to go, and all we have to do is— Quiet, Brian cut her off. She might hear. She's a heavy sleeper. I checked, so they're watching me sleep. They're probably listening at the door, waiting for me to fall asleep so they can talk about their plans. It made me uncomfortable to think that I'd been living under the same roof for an unknown amount of time with people who saw me as an obstacle to their well-being. We looked at the deeds, Brian said. The house is in her name. Bank accounts, too. We didn't find a will. So she didn't make one. Good for us. Provided she doesn't change her mind. She won't if we organize it right. The key is not to give her time to think. I tensed up, trying not to miss a word. What kind of thinking was Jessica talking about? What exactly were they not going to let me think about? I'll talk to her again tomorrow, Jessica continued. I'll tell her I found a good notary who can come to the house. Convenient, safe, no need to go anywhere. And if she refuses, she won't. I know how to talk to her. It's all about presenting it in the right way, not as pressure, but as concern. Brian mumbled something back, but I couldn't understand the words. Then there was the sound of a chair hitting the floor, someone standing up again. I cautiously peeked out from behind the couch and saw Jessica's silhouette at the window. She was looking out, but her posture was tense, ready for action. We have to hurry, she said without turning around. I have a bad feeling about this situation. What bad feeling? She's watching us too closely. She's asking questions. Tonight at dinner, I realized she suspects something. Shouldn't we wait? Let her calm down? No. Jessica turned to her husband, and I could see her face in the streetlight. It was hard, determined. The longer we wait, the more chance she'll figure it out. And then we could end up with nothing. But if she realizes that she won't if we're careful. Tomorrow I'll start talking about the documents. I'll tell her it's for her own safety. I'll make a convincing argument. I realized it was time to back off. Carefully, trying not to squeak the floorboards, I made my way to the stairs and up to my room. My heart was beating so loudly that it sounded like it could be heard throughout the house. Thoughts swarmed in my head, but one was the main one. Tomorrow Jessica would try to force me to sign some paperwork. I sat on the bed and tried to make sense of what I'd heard. They were looking for a will, studying the deeds to the house, scheduling a meeting with a notary. All of it indicated that they needed my signature on the papers that would give them rights to my property, power of attorney, deed of gift, will. The options were different, but the essence was the same. There were voices downstairs again, but now they were even quieter, and I couldn't make out the words. Then there were footsteps on the stairs. They were finally going to their rooms. The door to their bedroom closed, and the house fell silent. I lay awake until morning, running through the different scenarios in my head. I could accuse them directly of overhearing the conversation, but that would mean open conflict. I could pretend I didn't know anything and see how far they'd go. Or I could be proactive. In the morning, I got up early, like I always did. I showered, got dressed, went down to the kitchen. Brian was still asleep, and Jessica didn't show up until 8:30, when I'd finished breakfast. She looked awake and alert and ready for action. "Good morning, Doris," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Did you sleep well?" "Fine, thanks. And you?" "Fine." Jessica sat down across from me, cup in hand. "By the way, I was thinking about our conversation last night. Maybe you're right, and maybe we shouldn't rush into things. I've been worried. After the conversation I'd overheard last night, it sounded odd, to say the least. But still," Jessica continued, "there's one thing to consider. I have an acquaintance who works as a notary, a very good specialist, an honest person. She could come to our house and just advise us on the documents. Not to sign something, but just for information. Why would I need a notary consultation? Well, just to make sure all your paperwork's in order. I don't know what's changed in the laws over the years." Jessica spoke in a light tone, but I could see how tense she was looking at me. "It's free. She's coming as a friend." "Thank you, but I don't see the need yet." "Doris." Jessica's voice became more persuasive. "I'm not insisting. I'm just suggesting it. At our age, at your age, it's better to be safe. Again, with the age thing. They obviously thought I was old and gullible, counting on them to confuse or intimidate me, but I wasn't as naive as they wanted me to think. "All right," I said suddenly to myself. "Have your friend come over. We'll see what she says." Jessica's face lit up with a smile. "Great. I'll call her today. We'll make an appointment for tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Just let her tell me in advance what documents she needs for the consultation." "Sure, I will." Jessica finished her coffee and got up from the table. "You'll see, it'll be very helpful." After she left, I was left alone in the kitchen. Agreeing to meet with the notary had been a spontaneous decision, but now I understood his logic. Better to know exactly what they were planning than to guess in the dark. Besides, the presence of an outsider might make things clearer. A real notary would hardly agree to any dubious transactions. Brian showed up in the kitchen around 9, sleepy and disheveled. Jessica had already left for work, leaving him a note about the arrangement with the notary. He read it and looked at me with surprise. "Mom, did you really agree to a consultation? Is that a bad thing? You were the one who said you needed to get the documents in order." "No, of course it's good. It's just unexpected." Brian poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. He looked worried, as if my agreement was creating problems instead of solving them. Perhaps he'd expected a longer preparation, a gradual pressure, and here I was speeding up the process. "When would the notary arrive?" he asked. Jessica said tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. "I see." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Mom, you realize we only want what's best for you, right? Everything we're offering is for your peace of mind." "Of course I understand," I answered, looking him straight in the eye. "I trust you completely." The day passed in a deceptive calm. Jessica left for work right after breakfast, and Brian was in the living room with his laptop, supposedly browsing job sites. I did the usual household chores: laundry, cleaning, making dinner. Everything looked normal, but beneath the surface of normalcy lurked a tension that could be felt in every look, in every word. Brian was acting emphatically natural, even too natural. He came up to me in the kitchen a few times, asking how I was feeling, offering to help me cook. When I was ironing the laundry in the living room, he made phone calls to various companies, asking about possible job openings. The conversations were loud, detailed, as if he wanted to convince me that he was really actively looking for a job. Yes, I realize you need more experience, he said into the phone. Maybe it makes sense to consider an internship. I'm ready for any conditions, just to start working. But I noticed that between calls he was silent for long periods of time, staring at the laptop screen, not reading or typing anything. His fingers drummed nervously on the keys, his gaze occasionally sliding in my direction, checking to see if I was watching him. Jessica came home around 6 p.m. in high spirits. She announced in the hallway that she had spoken to the notary and the appointment was for 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. She's a very nice woman, Jessica said as she took off her shoes. She agreed to come to our house right away. She said it was quite common for elderly clients. There's that word again, elderly. They kept reminding me of my age, as if it were some kind of handicap or disability. What's her name? I asked. Carol Anderson, been working at the notary's office on Main Street for years, very experienced and reliable. Over dinner, Jessica continued to extol the virtues of tomorrow's meeting. Carol, she said, specialized specifically in elderly counseling, was well versed in probate and guardianship issues, and could give the best advice. What exactly will she be counseling? I asked. Well, she'll look at your documents, tell you if everything is correct. Jessica gestured with her fork, explaining. Maybe suggest some changes or additions. You know, laws change all the time, and what was relevant 5 years ago may be outdated now. Brian nodded, supporting his wife. Yes, Mom, it's really important. It's better to know the ins and outs beforehand than to run into trouble later. What kind of trouble? All kinds of trouble, Brian stammered, obviously not expecting the question. Well, for example, if you need to solve a financial issue quickly and the paperwork isn't right, or if the hospital required a power of attorney for medical procedures. Those explanations sounded strained. I did not have any problems with documents. I appeared in hospitals only for routine checkups, and I solved financial issues on my own and without difficulties. Why did I need an urgent consultation with a notary then? After dinner, I went up to my room as usual. I said I wanted to read before bed and went to bed early. Brian and Jessica stayed downstairs watching some movie. The sound of the TV and occasionally their voices came from my room. Around 9 p.m., the TV was turned off and the house was relatively quiet. I was reading a detective novel, trying to distract myself from my obsessive thoughts about tomorrow. The heroine of the book was investigating a real estate fraud, and the similarities to my situation were painful. At 10:30, I put the book down and decided to go down to the kitchen for a glass of milk. The habit of drinking milk before going to bed had stayed with me since childhood, and warm milk with honey always helped me relax. I went down the stairs quietly, trying not to wake the household if they were already asleep. Only the nightlight was on in the hallway, casting a dim glow on the familiar surroundings. Everything was quiet, but as I passed the living room, muffled voices came to me. Stopping at the ajar door, I realized Brian was on the phone. The voice was quiet, but distinct enough to make out the words. Jessica was sitting next to him on the couch. I could see her silhouette in the dim light of the desk lamp. Yes, tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Brian said into the phone. It's all set. She's agreed to the meeting. No, she wasn't suspicious. On the contrary, she'd taken the initiative. My heart quickened. He was talking about me, and the tone was clearly conspiratorial. Will the papers be ready? Brian continued. Good. Are you sure she's coming? I see. Yeah, well, if something goes wrong, you can always say it was just a consultation. Jessica whispered something to her husband. but I couldn't hear what she said. Brian nodded and spoke into the phone again. Look, are you sure it's legal? I mean, if she wants to call it off later. The voice on the other end of the line said something, and Brian relaxed visibly. Yeah, I see. The main thing is that the signature must be voluntary. Yes, of course, there's no compulsion. We'll just explain that it's for her own good. I was out of breath. They were planning to get me to sign something tomorrow, and it was definitely not a simple counseling session. Some documents were already being prepared, and the success of the operation depended solely on my signature. What about the division of property? Brian asked. Would the house be sold right away, or would I have to wait? Jessica whispered something again, and this time I could make out a few words. Take your time. Suspicion? Yeah, you're right, Brian agreed. It's better to wait a month or two. But the main thing is that legally everything will be clear. Okay, thanks. I'll see you tomorrow. He put the phone down, and Jessica immediately moved closer to him. She spoke louder now, and I could hear every word. How's it going? Everything okay? Yeah, Carol confirmed she's coming tomorrow. The paperwork's ready, just need Mom's signature. And what exactly is she signing? A power of attorney for the estate and bank accounts, plus a will in our favor. Jessica laughed softly, and I could hear the triumph and relief in that laugh. I can't believe it's all working out so easily. I was afraid I was going to have to be more drastic. What do you mean? Well, declare her incompetent, get a guardianship. That would be more complicated and longer. This way, it's one day, and it's all ours. Brian paused for a moment, then said worriedly, what if she figures it out? If she wants to read the documents carefully? She won't. Carol knows how to deal with clients like that. She'll say they're standard forms, nothing special. Older people rarely read legal texts because they think it's too complicated. And if they do read it, then we'll explain that the power of attorney is needed in case of an emergency. If something happens to her, we can deal with financial matters quickly. A will is just a sensible precaution at her age. Jessica got up from the couch and walked over to the window. In profile, her face looked hard, determined. The main thing is not to give her time to think. Carol will come over, explain everything quickly. We'll sign the papers, and it's done. And then? And then we'll live in peace. Jessica's voice became dreamy. Sell the house, buy something smaller in a good neighborhood. We'll invest the rest of the money. We can live off the interest without working. And Mom? Mom will live with us. We're not monsters, Brian. We'll just make sure she doesn't make any unwise financial decisions. Those words sounded particularly cynical. They were planning to strip me of all my assets, yet they thought they were caring relatives, saving me from my own irrationality. Do you think she won't realize what happened? Brian asked. What will she be able to do? The power of attorney will be executed legally with a notary public. So will the will. If she wants to contest it, she'll need proof of coercion or incapacity. And where would she get that? But morally, morally. Jessica turned to her husband, her voice hard. Brian, we've been living in this house for 2 years as servants, cooking, cleaning, listening to her lecture us. You can't get a proper job because you have to be home all the time to look after her. I work for pennies because I can't afford to look for something better. When will it end? But she's a mother. She's a selfish old woman who doesn't think about our future. Do you know how much this house is worth? How much is in her accounts? We could have a completely different life. Brian didn't answer, and there was a heavy pause. Jessica walked back to the couch and sat down next to her husband. Look, this is our only chance. If we miss it, we'll be stuck with it for the rest of our lives. And it's not eternal. Sooner or later, we'll get the inheritance anyway. So why not get it now, while we're still young enough to take advantage of it? Makes sense, Brian admitted, but it's still scary. It's not scary at all. Carol will be here tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We'll sign everything, and in a week, we'll own the house and the bank accounts. And your mom won't even know what happened. They were silent for a moment, each thinking about something else. Then Jessica added, "Speaking of accounts, did you find out how much money is in there?" Roughly, the bank statements we found show about 80,000 in deposits, plus a current account where the pension comes in, plus some investments. I didn't get it right, but there's a lot in there too. Jessica whistled. Not bad for a pensioner. I thought it was 30,000 tops. Daddy was a good earner and a saver, plus the insurance when he died. All the more reason not to hesitate. What if she decides to donate the money to some charity or rewrite her will in favor of her girlfriends? She won't. She has no other close relatives. What about girlfriends? That Pam from Colorado or whatever her name is? She could talk some crazy shit to Mom. Mom hasn't talked to her in 6 months. Thank God. Jessica stood up and stretched. Okay, enough worrying. Tomorrow everything would be resolved. It's bedtime. I heard them start to rise from the couch, and I hurried away from the door. I took a few steps to the stairs and silently made my way up to my room. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to be heard throughout the house. In the bedroom, I locked the door and sat on the bed. My hands were shaking and my mouth was dry. What I'd heard exceeded my worst fears. They didn't just want power of attorney to manage my finances, they planned to take possession of my entire estate, including my house and savings. At 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, Carol Anderson, who, judging from the conversation, was not just an acquaintance of Jessica's, but an accomplice in the scheme, was scheduled to arrive. She would bring with her ready-made documents, a power of attorney and a will that would strip me of everything I had. But the scariest part wasn't the financial loss. The scariest part was realizing that my own son was willing to betray me for money, that he saw 2 years of care and hospitality as a forced labor, that in his eyes I was not a mother, but an obstacle to a prosperous life. Jessica turned out to be the one who pushed Brian to this deed, but he did not resist. On the contrary, he was actively involved in the planning, studying my documents, looking for ways to take possession of the property. Maybe deep down he had some remorse, but that didn't stop him from acting against me. I went to the window and looked out. The night was quiet and calm, the streetlights illuminating the familiar houses of our neighborhood. Everything looked peaceful and safe, but I knew that tomorrow my life could change drastically. If Brian and Jessica's plan succeeded, I would be left without a home, without money, completely at their mercy. But they were wrong about one thing. I wasn't about to meekly sign documents that would strip me of everything. 30 years of working with people had taught me not only to recognize deception, but also to resist it. The night passed without sleep. I lay in bed, working out a plan of action. At first, I considered different options: to go to the police, to contact a lawyer, to ask for help from neighbors. But each of these ways had its disadvantages. The police were unlikely to take seriously a complaint about a fraud that had been planned but not yet committed. A lawyer would demand evidence I didn't have, and neighbors would at best express sympathy, but no real help was to be expected. By morning, I had made a decision. I had to disappear before Carol Anderson arrived, leaving Brian and Jessica to face the fact that I was gone. Without me, their plan would fall apart. No one would be able to sign the paperwork. And while they were looking for me and trying to figure out what had happened, I'd have time to think about what to do next. The first problem was where to go. I had almost no relatives left, just a few distant cousins we hadn't spoken to in years. Old girlfriends lived in different states, and not everyone was in regular contact. But there was Pam Wilson, my coworker and close friend for 20 years. Pam moved to Colorado 5 years ago after retiring. She bought a small house in a mountain community near Denver, where she lived quietly, gardening and reading. We emailed and exchanged Christmas cards, but after Brian and Jessica moved in with me, our communication became less regular. It was Pam who was the friend whose meetings with Brian considered dangerous to my health. It was her visits that Jessica greeted with ill-concealed irritation. Now I understood why they had been so insistent in discouraging me from talking to her. Pam knew me too well not to notice the strange behavior of my household. At 7:30 in the morning, I got up and went quietly down to the kitchen. Brian and Jessica were still asleep. Their alarm clock usually rang at 7:30. I had about an hour to make some important calls without attracting attention. I knew Pam's phone number by heart. The time difference between Nevada and Colorado was an hour, so it was already 8:30 in the morning, quite a good time to call. Pam answered after the third ring. Hello? Pam, it's Doris. I'm sorry to call so early. Doris! Her friend's voice immediately became warmer. What a pleasant surprise. How are you? How's your health? Pam, I need help. I decided not to waste time explaining myself over the phone. Can I come visit you for a few days? It's a complicated situation. I'll tell you when I see you. There was a pause on the phone. Pam was smart enough to realize that if I was asking for asylum, it must be serious. Sure, come by. When are you planning on coming? Tonight. This afternoon if I can make it. Okay. Do you remember the address? If not, I'll give it to you again. I do. Pam, it's very important that if anyone calls looking for me, you tell them you don't know anything about my plans. Got it? Pam's voice became serious. Doris, are you safe? For now, yes, but the situation could change. Then hurry up. I'll be waiting. The conversation took less than 5 minutes. The next step was to buy a bus ticket. There were several companies running flights from Las Vegas to Denver, and I had found one online that departed at 1 o'clock, arriving at 10 p.m. local time. You could buy a ticket online or at the bus station ticket office. The online purchase left an electronic trail that Brian and Jessica could trace if they thought to check my bank card. It was better to drive to the bus station and pay cash. At 8 in the morning, Jessica showed up, fresh and alert. She made herself some coffee and sat at the table with the look of someone anticipating a good day. Good morning, Doris. Did you sleep well? Not bad, thanks. Did you? Fine. Jessica smiled. You know, I'm so glad you agreed to meet Carol. I'm sure it'll be very helpful. I hope so. I poured myself a cup of coffee, trying to look calm. What time is she getting here? 2 o'clock. I'd arranged it for that time, after lunch, when everything's quiet and no one's in a hurry. Do I have to go somewhere with her? No, not at all. She'll bring everything she needs with her. Jessica spoke easily, but I noticed how closely she was watching my reactions. If we need to sign anything, we'll do it at home. It's much more convenient than going to a notary's office. At 9:30, Brian showed up. He looked rested and positive. Apparently, the doubts of the night had receded, and he was ready to carry out the plan again. Mom, how are you feeling? He asked, pouring coffee. I'm fine. I'm a little nervous about the meeting with the notary. You don't have to worry, Brian reassured her. Carol is very experienced and will explain everything in simple terms. If there's anything you don't understand, you can always ask her again. What exactly do I have to sign? Brian and Jessica looked at each other. It was a straightforward question, and it was difficult to evade the answer. Well, as we were saying, Jessica began, it might be a good idea to get a power of attorney in case you need help with financial matters. And a will, Brian added. At your age, that's a sensible precaution. A will? I acted surprised. Shouldn't you be in a hurry? There's no rush, Mom. It's better to prepare ahead of time. Brian spoke carefully, choosing his words. You know how it is. Everything's fine today, and then tomorrow something unexpected can happen. I know. I paused, then added, Okay, let Carol explain what and how. If it's really necessary, I'll sign it. Jessica's face lit up with a satisfied smile. That's right. You'll see, it will be very simple and straightforward. After breakfast, Jessica left for work, and Brian settled down in the living room with his laptop. I announced that I was going grocery shopping for lunch. It would give me a chance to go to the bus station and buy a ticket. Do you want a ride? Brian offered. Thanks, but I'll walk. The doctor says I should walk more. Well, don't take too long. I don't want Carol to get here early. I left the house at 10 in the morning. The bus station was a 20-minute bus ride from our neighborhood. The ticket to Denver cost $87, a reasonable amount that wouldn't hit my budget too hard. Departing at 1 o'clock from Platform 4, the cashier informed me. Arrival in Denver at 10 o'clock at night. Will you be checking luggage? No, just carry on. I tucked the ticket in my purse and headed back home. On the way, I stopped at a supermarket and bought some lunch to keep up the appearance of a normal day. At 12:30, I was home. Brian was still sitting with his laptop, but now he was on the phone with one of his potential employers. The conversation was businesslike and serious. Perhaps he was actually considering a vacancy rather than just feigning activity. Yes, I'm ready to start on Monday, he said. The salary is satisfactory. The only condition is that the job must be in Las Vegas. I'm not ready to move. It was interesting to hear that no movement clause. If they were planning to take over my house and sell it, why would Brian tie himself to a certain city? Either he really wasn't going to screw me over, or he was just reassuring himself in case the plan didn't work out. I made dinner and called my son to the table. We ate in silence, each of us thinking about something else. Brian glanced at the clock from time to time. It was less than 2 hours before Carol arrived, and his nervousness was becoming more and more noticeable. Mom, he said at last, you realize we're doing this for your own good, don't you? Of course, I trust you completely. And if Carol suggests signing something, you won't mind. I'll listen and think. If it's really necessary and reasonable, of course I'll sign. Brian nodded, but I could see he wasn't completely satisfied with my answer. He had expected a more unconditional agreement, a willingness to sign whatever documents he wanted without question. After lunch, I went up to my room, saying I wanted to rest before the meeting. In fact, it was necessary to pack the most necessary things. I couldn't take a large bag or suitcase, it would arouse suspicion. But a small travel bag, the kind I usually took to the clinic, could be smuggled in unnoticed. The bag contained a change of underwear, a toothbrush, the medicines I took regularly, and a small amount of cash, about $300, which I kept at home for emergencies. I folded my documents, passport, driver's license, medical records, into my wallet. It took the most time to compose the note. I needed to explain my act, but not reveal my plans. After a few drafts, I wrote succinctly, Brian and Jessica went to a friend's house for a few days. Need time to think about my life. Don't worry, I'm safe. I'll be back when I'm ready. Doris. I left the note on the kitchen table. That's where they'd be sure to find it when they looked for me before the notary came. At 12:30, I went downstairs. Brian was sitting in the living room, nervously flipping through a magazine, glancing at his watch and out the window from time to time. When he saw me, he stood up. Mom, are you ready for the meeting? Yeah, I'm ready. I just want to go to the clinic one more time. Yesterday, I forgot to take the results of the tests. Now? What if you don't make it back in time? I'll make it. It won't take long at the clinic, and it's an hour and a half before 2 o'clock. Brian hesitated, clearly reluctant to let me leave the house on such an important day. Why don't you go tomorrow? Or I could give you a ride. It'd be faster. Thanks, but I need a walk. I'm nervous about my meeting with the notary. I want to get some fresh air. Okay, but don't take too long. Carol could be here before 2. I took my purse with my documents and money, in which I discreetly placed a small travel bag. In the hallway, I put on my jacket and headed for the door. Mom, Brian called out to me, are you sure you haven't changed your mind? About the meeting with the notary? No, I haven't changed my mind. I turned to my son and looked him in the eye. I'm willing to sign whatever it takes. It was a lie, but Brian believed it. He was relieved to have final confirmation that I was willing to cooperate. I'll see you in an hour, I said, and left the house. The bus to the bus station arrived 10 minutes later. I sat at the window and watched the streets of North Las Vegas floating by, thinking about the fact that I was coming back here at an unknown time. Maybe in a week, maybe in a month, or maybe never. It depended on how events unfolded. At the bus station, it was 20 minutes before departure. I bought a coffee from the vending machine and sat in the waiting room, watching the crowd of passengers. People were hurrying to the buses, saying goodbye to their farewellers, studying the schedule. The usual hustle and bustle of an ordinary day in which the private drama of an individual is lost. At 1 o'clock, they announced boarding for the flight to Denver. I got up and headed for the platform exit, leaving behind the house where my son and daughter-in-law were waiting for me with papers ready to strip me of all my possessions. The bus left right on schedule. I sat at the window and watched Las Vegas slowly pass behind me. First, the industrial districts with warehouses and workshops, then the suburbs with monotonous houses, and finally, the Nevada desert with its vast expanse and sparse hills. With each mile, I felt the tension leave my body, giving way to a strange relief. There weren't many passengers on the bus, an elderly couple with large bags, a young woman with a child, a few men who had settled down to sleep. The air conditioning was working properly, the seats were comfortable, and the trip promised to go smoothly. I took out of my purse the book I had brought for the road, but I couldn't read. My thoughts kept returning to what was happening at home. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, as the bus passed through a small town in central Nevada, I pictured the scene unfolding in my living room. Carol Anderson arrives with a folder of documents ready to be signed. Jessica greets her with a welcoming smile, ushers her into the house, and seats her in a chair. Brian offers coffee or tea, showing hospitality and family harmony. Where's Doris? Carol had to ask. She'll be right in, Jessica replies. She went to the clinic to get some tests and promised to be back by 2. Minutes pass. Carol glances at her watch. Brian paces nervously around the room. Jessica calls my phone. My phone is off in my purse. I turned it off at the bus station, anticipating the calls. No answer, Jessica says, putting the receiver away. That's weird. She always keeps her phone on. Maybe it's dead, Brian suggests. Or did she forget it at home? They go to check my room and find no phone or any other sign that I was going to be back soon. Carol starts to get impatient. She probably has other appointments scheduled and she can't wait indefinitely. Why don't we reschedule for tomorrow? She suggests. No, Jessica hastens to assure her. She'll be here soon. There's just a line at the clinic or something delayed. But the time is ticking and I'm still out. At 3:30, Brian goes into the kitchen to get water and finds my note on the table. I could clearly picture his face at that moment. First the bewilderment, then the horror of realization. Jess, come here, he calls to his wife in a trembling voice. Jessica reads the note and turns pale. Her carefully thought-out plan is crumbling before her eyes. Instead of signing documents and gaining control of my property, they are left with nothing, and with the need to explain themselves to Carol. What's wrong? The notary asks as she enters the kitchen. Doris, gone, Brian says with difficulty. To a friend's for a few days. Carol looks at the note, then at the two of them. An experienced con artist, she must have been in this kind of situation and knows that when a potential victim disappears at the last moment, it means she suspects something. It's a shame, Carol says coldly. The paperwork's done, time's wasted. Hopefully, next time it will be more organized. She gathers the papers into a folder and heads for the exit. Brian and Jessica see her off, apologizing, promising to be sure to get in touch when I get back. But they see the skepticism in Carol's eyes. She realizes that the project has failed. After the notary leaves, panic sets in. Jessica calls me every 10 minutes, but the phone is unavailable. Brian tries to remember which friend I might have gone to. They search through my things for my address book, look through the notes on my desk, dig through my desk drawers. The bus made a half-hour stop in Salt Lake City. I got off to stretch, bought a sandwich and coffee at the train station cafe. At a neighboring table sat a woman about my age with her teenage granddaughter. They were animatedly discussing plans for the weekend: a hike in the mountains, fishing on the lake, a barbecue in the garden. The usual family idyll that I will never have with my own son. Back on the bus, I turned my phone on for a few seconds to check my messages. 27 missed calls from Brian and Jessica, dozens of text messages. The first ones were polite and concerned. "Mom, where are you? The notary has arrived." "Doris, please answer. We're worried." "Mom, what's wrong? Why did you leave?" Then the tone of the messages became more desperate. "Mom, it's some kind of misunderstanding. Let's talk." "Doris, we can talk about it. Come home." "Where are you?" "We'd do anything to have you back." The last messages were clearly written by Jessica. The style was more aggressive. "Doris, this is irresponsible of you. We're worried to death. You're being selfish. Think of us. If you think you can fool us like this, you're wrong." I turned my phone off again. These messages only confirmed that my decision was correct. The evolution in tone from feigned concern to outright aggression was especially telling. The masks fell off pretty quickly. By late afternoon, the bus had crossed the Colorado border. Outside the windows, the mountain scenery, illuminated by the setting sun, floated by. The air was getting cooler, and I could breathe easier. With each mile, I felt myself moving away, not only geographically, but also emotionally from the life I had left behind in Las Vegas. Pam met me at the bus station in Denver. She hadn't changed much over the years. The same attentive blue eyes, the same energetic gait, just more gray in her hair and deeper wrinkles around her eyes. "Doris!" She gave me a big, friendly hug. "I'm so glad to see you. Though the circumstances are not exactly pleasant. I'll tell you, darling," I promised. "Or better at home, over a cup of tea." The drive to the village took about an hour. Pam drove confidently, despite the mountain serpentine and poor lighting. On the way, we talked about little things: her house, her garden, her neighbors in the village. I sensed that she was patiently waiting for explanations, but not rushing things. Pam's house turned out to be a cozy one-story Alpine-style structure surrounded by spruce and pine trees. Inside, it smelled of wood and apple pie. The fireplace crackled quietly, creating an atmosphere of peace and safety. "Sit down and make yourself comfortable," Pam said, leading me into the living room. "I'll put the kettle on, and you tell me what brings you to me at this strange hour." Over tea and homemade cake, I told her the whole story, from Brian and Jessica moving in with me to the conversation I'd overheard and the escape. Pam listened attentively, asking clarifying questions from time to time. Her face grew more and more serious as she listened. "Oh my God, Doris," she said when I finished. "I've always sensed something wrong with your sister-in-law's behavior. Do you remember how she used to greet me on my visits? Like I was an unwelcome guest in your own home. Now I understand why. They didn't want witnesses to their behavior." "And Brian? Was he really willing to betray you?" That question was the most painful. I paused, searching for words. I guess so. Maybe Jessica pressured him, but he didn't resist. On the contrary, he was actively involved in the planning. Pam shook her head. It's hard to believe. I remember him as a boy, so quiet and obedient. Who would have thought he'd be capable of such a thing? People change, or they just show their true colors when temptation strikes. We sat up late into the night talking. Pam offered me a guest room on the second floor, with windows overlooking the mountains and forest. The bed was fresh and soft, and I could smell the pine in the air. After the long drive and emotional turmoil, sleep came quickly. In the morning, I woke up to birds singing outside the window. The sun was illuminating the mountain tops, and the air was clean and cool. For the first time in many months, I felt truly at peace. No one was watching my actions, making plans for my possessions, or restricting my freedom under the guise of caring. At breakfast, Pam asked, "What do you plan to do next?" "I don't know yet. I need time to think, to analyze the situation. Maybe a week, maybe more. Stay as long as you need. I enjoy the company, and the house is big." I turned on my phone to check my messages. 15 more missed calls had accumulated overnight. The messages became even more desperate. "Mom, we've called every hospital. Where are you? Doris, if you're reading this, please at least let me know you're alive. Mom, I'll go to the police if you don't get in touch." That last message made me laugh. Going to the police was the last thing they wanted to do. Too many uncomfortable questions could arise about the reasons for my disappearance. I sent one short message: "I'm safe. Don't call again." After that, I turned my phone off again. Pam was right. I needed time to think about my future plans. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to Brian and Jessica's house anytime soon. The week in the mountains of Colorado flew by. The days were made up of simple but pleasant activities: morning walks on the forest paths, reading on the porch, long conversations with Pam about the past and the future. The mountain air had a healing effect. The tension of the last months gradually receded, and his thoughts became clearer. Pam was the perfect hostess, caring but not intrusive. She gave me a chance to rest and come to my senses without demanding immediate decisions or explanations. We cooked together, went to the local grocery store for groceries, sat by the fireplace in the evenings. A simple, measured life that I had missed so much in recent years. Every morning I turned on my phone for a few minutes to check for messages from Brian and Jessica. Their number gradually dwindled and their tone became more and more aggressive. First, they begged me to come back. Then they threatened to go to the police. And finally, they accused me of being selfish and irresponsible. On the third day came a text from Brian. "Mom, if you don't come back by Sunday, we will be forced to take drastic measures. We need to think about our future." This message was telling. They were tired of waiting and were beginning to take action on their own. Exactly what drastic measures Brian had in mind, one could only guess. Perhaps they had decided to occupy the house and live in it as if it were their own property. Perhaps they planned to seek legal advice on how to get custody of their missing mother. Friday came the final message from Jessica. "Doris, your behavior is simply unacceptable. We can no longer wait and build a life of uncertainty. Do whatever you want." After that, the calls and messages stopped. Apparently, they had made some kind of decision and no longer felt the need to contact me. It was even for the best. I was tired of their persistent attempts to get me to come back. "What do you think you're going to do?" Pam asked me Saturday night as we sat around the fireplace with glasses of wine. "It's time to go back," I replied, "to see what they've done in my week's absence." "You're not afraid?" "No, now I know what they're capable of. The element of surprise is on my side." "Do you want me to come with you?" The offer was tempting, but I shook my head. "Thank you, but that's my problem. Besides, The presence of a stranger might piss them off even more. Then promise to call regularly. And if anything goes wrong, come back here immediately. Sunday morning, Pam drove me to the Denver bus station. The goodbye was warm, but not sad. We both realized it wasn't forever. Friendship, tested over the years, did not depend on distance or circumstance. The drive back to Las Vegas seemed shorter. I thought a lot about the upcoming conversation with Brian and Jessica, planning what I would say to them. The main thing was to stay calm and not let myself be drawn into an emotional tussle. The facts spoke for themselves, and I wasn't going to listen to any excuses. The bus arrived in Las Vegas at 7:30 in the evening. I took a cab home. After a long drive, I didn't want to take public transportation for another hour. The driver was a chatty Filipino who talked about his family and his plans to move to California. I listened half-heartedly, thinking more about what awaited me back home. The house was unusually quiet. The windows were tightly shuttered, though it was still light outside. There was an unfamiliar car in the yard, an old pickup truck with Nevada plates. So someone was visiting or they'd hired someone to help them. I pulled out my keys and opened the front door. There were cardboard boxes taped together in the hallway. They were labeled with black marker. Kitchen, living room, books, housewares. From the back of the house came voices and the sounds of objects being moved. Taking off my shoes, I walked quietly into the living room. The picture I saw was beyond my expectations. Brian and Jessica, along with two strange men, were packing up my furniture and belongings. The couch was wrapped in foil, paintings had been removed from the walls, and bookshelves stood empty. "Be careful with that chair," Jessica said to one of the men. "It's an antique. It's expensive." The chair was an ordinary one, bought at a furniture store about 10 years ago. But in Jessica's plans, it had obviously become a valuable antique. "Where's the TV going?" Brian asked. "To the garage for now. Then we'll decide whether to sell it or keep it." They didn't even notice my presence, too busy dividing up their possessions. I leaned against the door jamb and watched. The most interesting thing was how natural they felt to dispose of other people's things. "Good evening," I said loudly and clearly. The reaction was immediate. Jessica dropped the vase she'd been wrapping in the newspaper. Brian froze with the painting in his hands, staring at me like a ghost. The two workers looked at each other, sensing something wrong. "Mom?" Brian squeezed himself out. "When did you get back?" "Just now." I walked into the room and looked around at the mess. "It's interesting to see how quickly you've settled into my house." Jessica was the first to come to her senses. "Doris, we were so worried. Where have you been? Why didn't you answer your cell phone?" "I was where I thought I should be." I turned to the workers. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid your services are no longer required. You may go." The men set the boxes aside with relief and headed for the exit. One of them, passing Brian, muttered, "The settlement will be tomorrow, as agreed." After they left, there was a heavy silence in the house. Brian set the painting on the floor and sat down on the packed couch. Jessica stood in the middle of the room, nervously rubbing a scrap of newspaper in her hands. "Mom, we can explain everything," Brian began. "I'm sure you can." I sat down in the only chair that wasn't already packed. "But first, I'll explain something to you." Jessica and Brian looked at each other. They looked worried and confused. "I know about your plans," I said calmly. "I know about the notary, Carol Anderson, about the power of attorney and the will you wanted me to sign. I know about your calculations about selling the house and my savings." Jessica's face turned pale, and Brian opened his mouth but couldn't get a word out. "How did you—" Jessica began but stopped short. "How did I know?" "Simple. I overheard your conversation the night you planned to meet with the notary. The walls in the house are thin, and you were talking pretty loud." There was a new pause. Jessica sank slowly to the edge of the couch, as if her legs were no longer holding her up. Mom, it's not what you think, Brian tried to explain. We really wanted to help you with the paperwork. Brian, I interrupted him, don't humiliate yourself by lying. I heard Jessica laughing, talking about how everything will soon be yours. I heard you discussing selling the house and dividing the property. Jessica jumped up from the couch. So what? We've been living here like servants for 2 years, taking care of you, putting up with your quirks, giving up our own lives. No one forced you to stay here, I objected. The door was always open. Where should we go? We don't have money for our own place. Then earn some. Brian has been looking for a job for 6 months and can't find one. Amazing, isn't it? Brian blushed. I'm trying to find a suitable place. The right one? I laughed. You turn down half the jobs because they don't meet your idea of a decent salary, even though you're not making anything right now. Jessica's getting angry again. Enough! We're tired of this moralizing. Yes, we wanted to get power of attorney to manage your finances. What's the big deal? Sooner or later, you won't be able to manage on your own anyway. I'm doing better at 74 than you are at 30-something. You're not, Jessica screamed. You're a lonely, useless old woman clinging to the past. Those words should have hurt me, but all I felt was calm. The mask of caring daughter-in-law had finally come off, revealing Jessica's true attitude toward me. Maybe, I agreed, but this is my life, my home, my money, and I decide what to do with it. Brian tried to intervene. Mom, let's talk calmly. Maybe we really did rush into things, but our intentions were good. Your intentions, Brian, were motivated by a desire to get my inheritance without waiting for me to die. The only difference is that you did it more gently than your wife did. I got up from my chair and looked around the room with boxes and packed furniture. Now explain to me what this is all about. Why are you packing my things? Jessica and Brian looked at each other again. Finally, Jessica replied, We figured you weren't coming back, or that something had happened to you. We wanted to save the property. Preserve? For who? For the family? I see. So you assumed I was dead or missing and started dividing up the inheritance. How practical. There was a heavy silence. They no longer tried to justify or explain themselves. The truth was too obvious to be hidden behind pretty words. What's going to happen now? Brian asked quietly. I looked at my son, trying to find a shadow of remorse in his face, but all I saw was confusion and fear, the emotions of a man caught in the act. Now you will pack your things and leave my house, I said calmly. You have until tomorrow morning. My words hung in the air like a sentence. Brian and Jessica stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by boxes of my things, seemingly unable to believe what was happening. For long seconds, no one said a word. The ticking of the old clock on the mantel seemed deafeningly loud in that silence. Mom, you can't be serious, Vigayan finally said in a shaky voice. We are a family. People in a family forgive each other. Family? I slowly looked around at the packed things. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't plan to deprive their loved ones of their homes and livelihoods. Jessica jumped up from the couch, her face flaming with anger. Stop playing the victim. We've been living here for 2 years, listening to your comments and accommodating your whims. And now you're throwing us out on the street for some misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? I laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. Jessica, you call it a misunderstanding to plan to deprive me of all my assets with false documents? Forged? Brian straightened up, a defensive tone in his voice. The documents were real. We didn't forge anything. The papers may have been real, but their contents were drawn up without my knowledge or consent. You planned to force me to sign using deception and psychological pressure. Jessica crossed her arms over her chest. Prove it. You have no proof of our alleged criminal plans. Proof? I got up from my chair and moved closer to her. What about the fact that you started packing my things barely a week after I disappeared? Isn't that proof of your true intentions? We thought you were missing. Brian exploded. Or something had happened to you. Naturally, we wanted to preserve the property. Preserve it for who, Brian? For me? Or for yourself? He was silent, realizing that any answer would only make things worse. Jessica tried to take the initiative. Doris, let's be honest with each other. You're not old anymore. Sooner or later, you're going to need help with your finances and household management. We just wanted to prepare for that ahead of time. Prepare? I shook my head slowly. You wanted to take over everything while I was still in my right mind and couldn't stop you. The difference is significant. Mom, Brian took a step toward me, holding out his hands in a pleading gesture. Please, let's discuss this calmly. Maybe we did rush into things, but we can fix this. Fix it? I backed away from him. How do you fix betrayal, Brian? How do you fix the fact that my own son was willing to take everything away from me for money? Tears glistened in his eyes, but I felt no pity. The memories of the conversation I'd overheard, of his enthusiasm in discussing the sale of the house and the division of my savings, were too fresh. I didn't mean to hurt you, he whispered. It's just, it's just that we're so tired of living in uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, not having our own home, not having stability. Stability has to be earned, Brian, with your own labor, not other people's money. Jessica intervened in the conversation again, and her tone became openly aggressive. All right, have it your way. We'll leave. But don't think you can live here alone indefinitely. Old age is a tricky thing, and when you need help, don't count on us. I don't, I said calmly. After what I've learned, it would be naive to count on your help. She headed for the door, but on the threshold she turned around. You know what, Doris? You may be able to live alone for a few more years, but eventually you'll realize that we were the only people close to you. And then it'll be too late to change. Jessica, I said quietly but clearly, the people who plan to rob me can't be my loved ones. That's a contradiction in definition. She slammed the door so hard the glass shook. Brian stayed in the room, looking at me and at the door behind which his wife had disappeared. Mom, he tried again, I know you're angry, but I'm your son. Are you willing to cut all ties because of one mistake? One mistake? I sat back in my chair, suddenly feeling tired. Brian, this wasn't a spontaneous mistake. This was a deliberate plan that had been months in the making. You studied my files, restricted my contact with my friends, looked for ways to gain control of my finances, but nothing happened. We didn't sign any documents. We didn't take your money. The only reason it didn't happen is because I found out about your plans in time. If I hadn't overheard that conversation, I'd be penniless right now, completely at your mercy. He sank down on the couch, his face in his palms. His shoulders were shaking. Perhaps he was really crying, or perhaps he was just feigning remorse in a last desperate attempt to make me feel better. Mom, I don't know how to move on, he mumbled through his fingers. We don't have money for rent. I don't have a job. Jess has pennies. That's your problem, Brian. You're adults, and it's time you started taking responsibility for your actions. But where are we going to go? I don't know. A motel, friends, Jessica's parents. It's none of my business. He raised his head and looked at me with red eyes. Are you really ready to throw me out of your life forever? That was the hardest question to answer. Brian was my only child, the fruit of the love and hopes of my youth. 36 years ago, I had held him in my arms, fed him, sang lullabies, dreamed of his future. But that baby and this man ready to rob his own mother were very different people. Forever is a strong word, I said at last. Maybe someday we can talk. But right now, I need time. A lot of time. How much time? I don't know. Months, years, maybe never. It depends on a lot of factors. On what? On whether you can change, get a job, become self sufficient, stop relying on other people's money, and most importantly, whether you can truly repent for what you were planning to do. He was silent, pondering my words. Finally, he got up from the couch and headed for the door. Okay, we'll pack up and leave tomorrow morning. Until tomorrow morning, I confirmed. And Brian, take only what belongs to you. I'll be checking. After he left, I was alone in the trashed living room. Boxes of my belongings were everywhere, furniture was displaced, and scraps of packing material were lying on the floor. The house looked like it had been burglarized, which was pretty much true. I started unpacking boxes and putting things in their places. The work was physically demanding, but it helped me not to think about what had happened. Books back on the shelves, dishes in the cabinets, pictures on the walls. Slowly, the house began to take on a familiar look. From the upstairs bedroom came the sounds of packing. Jessica was slamming closet doors loudly, throwing something into suitcases, occasionally cursing in a low voice. Brian walked more quietly, but I could hear him moving boxes, folding clothes. Around 11 p.m., the noise upstairs stopped. I went up to check that they hadn't taken anything extra. There were 3 large suitcases and several boxes of personal belongings in their room. My furniture and appliances they hadn't touched. Apparently, they realized I would actually be checking. In the morning, I woke up to the sound of an engine in the yard. Looking out the window, I saw the same pickup truck that had been parked here yesterday. Brian and one of yesterday's workers were loading suitcases and boxes into the back. Jessica was standing nearby, smoking and looking at the house with an expression of poorly concealed anger. I went down to the kitchen and made coffee, watching them gather through the window. I didn't invite any of them into the house again. All the necessary conversations had been said yesterday. Brian glanced at the kitchen window a few times, but didn't dare go in. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, the loading was over. Jessica got into the driver's side of the pickup, and Brian got into his car. Before he left, he came out and stood on the porch for a few minutes looking at the house, probably hoping I'd come out to say goodbye or have a last word. But I continued to sip my coffee in the kitchen, showing no emotion. Finally, he got into his car, and both cars slowly drove out of the yard. I watched as they disappeared around the corner and felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. 2 years of living together were over, and the house was quiet again. The first thing I did was call a locksmith to change the locks. A middle-aged man arrived an hour later and changed the locks on all the doors in an hour and a half. Now Brian and Jessica had no way of getting back into the house without my permission. Trouble with the tenants? The locksmith asked as he gathered up his tools. Something like that, I answered evasively. After he left, I sat down at the phone and began to reconnect with the people Brian and Jessica had discouraged me from contacting. The first person I called was Pam to tell her about the story's denouement. "Thank God it's over," she said after hearing my story. "But how are you feeling? Wasn't it too hard to kick your own son out?" "Hard," I admitted, "but the right thing to do. I can't live with people who see me only as a source of income." "So, what now? Are you planning on living alone?" "For now. I have to get used to the idea of not having a family anymore. At least, not the kind of family I'd hoped for." Then I called Ruth Hammond, a former co-worker who lived across town. We hadn't spoken in almost 6 months. Jessica had always found reasons to discourage me from seeing her. "Doris," Ruth was delighted. "What a pleasant surprise. I thought you'd forgotten I existed." "No, it was just, there was a family emergency. Things are different now. Why don't we get together this weekend? Sure, come for lunch on Saturday. There's so much to talk about. By the evening, I had reconnected with 5 old friends and made appointments for the next few days. For the first time in months, I could plan my time without looking at other people's opinions or listening to lectures about safety. At dinner, I sat alone at the large table that, as recently as yesterday, had been set for 4. The silence of the house no longer seemed oppressive. On the contrary, it was full of possibilities. I could read late into the night without worrying about disturbing my neighbors. I could watch any TV program, listen to music, invite friends over without excuses or explanations. In the evening, the phone rang. Brian's number popped up on the screen. I stared at the blinking display for a long time, hesitating to answer. Eventually, curiosity overcame caution. Hello? Mom, it's me. Brian's voice sounded tired and depressed. We're staying at a motel. I was wondering, maybe you changed your mind? No, Brian, I haven't changed my mind. Mom, please, I realize I was wrong, but I'm your son. Are you really willing to lose me forever for money? I'm not losing you over money. I'm losing you over betrayal. Money is secondary, but you can forgive. Forgiveness has to be earned, Brian. I don't see you realizing the seriousness of what you've done. What do you want me to do? Become self-sufficient. Get a job. Get a place to live. Live on your own. And think about whether you're truly remorseful for what you've done or whether you're just sorry the plan didn't work out. He was silent for a moment, then said quietly, I'll call you in a few days. Don't. Call me in a few months, if you have something to say. After the conversation, I turned my phone off and put it on silent. Enough talking for today. It was time to start a new life, a life without the toxic people who only saw me as a source of material goods. As night fell outside, the house fell into silence. But it was a good silence, the silence of peace and independence. I was once again the master of my own destiny.